Achilles is the reason the word hero means what it means. 3,000 years of literature, art, and military rhetoric point back to him as the origin of glory in battle. But open the actual poem, and the first word Homer gives you isn't hero, it's menis, wrath. Homer is not writing an adventure story about a great warrior. He is writing a clinical record of a man whose ego is so fragile that a single public slight sends him into a rage that gets thousands killed, lets his best friend die in his place, and ends with him dragging a corpse behind his chariot for 12 days because killing the man wasn't enough. Heinz Kohut, the psychoanalyst who spent his career studying exactly this condition, had a name for it: narcissistic rage. Achilles is its founding case study, and once you see the diagnosis, the greatest hero in Western literature reads like a warning label. Every school reading of the Iliad frames Achilles as the tragic hero, proud, yes, but fundamentally noble, undone by forces larger than himself, fate, war, the gods. This reading survives because it's comforting. It lets us admire the warrior without examining the psychology underneath the armor. Homer doesn't cooperate with that reading. The poem opens in the 9th year of the war, a coalition army bled thin, and a commander, Agamemnon, who publicly strips Achilles of his war prize, a captive woman named Briseis, to save face after losing one of his own. It's a status humiliation staged in front of the entire army, and Achilles' response tells you everything the tragic hero reading wants you to skip past. He doesn't request a private audience. He doesn't appeal to the council. He nearly puts a sword through his commander's chest in front of every soldier present. And when the goddess Athena physically restrains him, he withdraws from the war entirely and asks his mother to pray for his own side's destruction, not a draw, not a stalemate, destruction. Achilles wants the Greek army, his own men, pushed to the edge of the sea and slaughtered so that Agamemnon will be forced to crawl back and admit publicly that he was wrong to disrespect him. That is the architecture of narcissistic injury, and Heinz Kohut mapped it in clinical detail nearly 3,000 years after a poet had already been describing it, accidentally, in a war camp outside Troy. Kohut spent the 1960s and 70s developing what became known as self-psychology, and at the center of it sits a structure he called the grandiose self. Every child in Kohut's account develops an early unrealistic sense of their own perfection and importance, handled well with what Kohut called mirroring, a caregiver's accurate, warm reflection of the child's worth. That grandiosity matures into healthy ambition and stable self-esteem, the capacity to fail at something without your entire identity collapsing. Handled badly, the grandiose self never integrates. It stays split off, brittle, and permanently dependent on the outside world to keep confirming it. Kohut called these external props self-objects, people who aren't experienced as separate individuals with their own inner lives, but as functions, instruments that exist to hold your sense of self together. When a self-object fails you, when someone treats you as ordinary instead of extraordinary, the injury isn't to your feelings, it's to the entire architecture of who you believe yourself to be. This is what Kohut meant by narcissistic rage, and he was precise about what separates it from ordinary anger. Ordinary anger wants something reasonable. An apology, a correction, a return to balance. Narcissistic rage wants annihilation. Kohut described it as containing the need for revenge, for righting a wrong, for undoing a hurt by whatever means, and a compulsion that gives the injured person no rest until the score is settled completely. The offending party stops being a person with their own perspective. They become an obstacle to be removed. Now go back to the war camp. Agamemnon has not injured Achilles' feelings. He has punctured the grandiose self directly, in public, in front of the self-objects, the entire army whose admiration is the only thing holding that self together. Homer gives Achilles a speech in Book 1 that reads less like a warrior's complaint and more like a session transcript. He tells Agamemnon he has fought the Trojans for a cause that was never his, taken the worst of the fighting while Agamemnon claims the largest share of the spoils, and now has that same commander stripping him of the one prize that marked his worth in front of everyone. In Samuel Butler's 1898 translation, Achilles calls Agamemnon a man clothed in shamelessness and tells him plainly he will take the ships home rather than stay to be dishonoured further. That word, dishonoured, is doing enormous work. Achilles isn't grieving Briseis. He barely mentions her again for the rest of the poem. He's grieving time, the Greek concept of honour as a publicly visible, constantly renewed currency, the exact mechanism a Kohutian self-object world runs on. Agamemnon didn't take a woman, he revoked the mirroring, and a self that has never developed anything sturdier than that mirroring to stand on has exactly one available response: destroy whoever revoked it, and destroy whatever it takes to force the mirror back into position. Here is what the Pride reading of Achilles consistently underplays. Narcissistic rage does not stay contained to the person who caused the injury. It reorganizes everything around it, including the people you claim to love most, and it does this quietly, disguised as strategy, disguised as principle, disguised as anything other than what it is. By Book 9, the war is going badly enough that Agamemnon sends an embassy to Achilles' tent. Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, carrying an offer of staggering wealth, tripods, gold, cauldrons, and Briseis herself returned untouched, along with a public oath that Agamemnon never went near her. By any ordinary accounting, the debt is paid. Achilles refuses, and the reason he gives is the tell. He says his mother has told him he has two possible fates: die at Troy and be remembered forever, or go home and live a long, obscure life. He tells the embassy, in Butler's rendering, that if he stays to fight, he will not return alive, but his name will live forever, and then he sends them away. Notice what isn't in that answer. No mention of the gold, the cauldrons, the returned woman, the apology. None of it registers because none of it can. Kohut's insight is exactly this. No external repair reaches a narcissistic injury because the injury was never about the object taken. It was about what the taking revealed, that Achilles could be treated as ordinary. Only Agamemnon's ruin will do. So the war grinds on without him, and the Greeks start dying in numbers that should alarm anyone who claims to love his men. Ships burn. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, watches the slaughter and finally does what the embassy could not. He begs, not for gold, for permission to put on Achilles' armour and lead the Myrmidons back into the fight, so the Trojans, mistaking him for Achilles, will fall back in fear. Achilles agrees, but attaches a condition that should stop you cold, drive them from the ships, and then stop. Do not press toward the walls of Troy. Do not win too much glory in armour that isn't yours. Sit with that for a second. Men are dying by the hundreds while Achilles negotiates the exact quantity of heroism his best friend is permitted to have, because any more would dilute his own. Patroclus goes out, fights brilliantly, drives the Trojan line back exactly as planned, and then, in the heat of it, does the human thing. He keeps going. He forgets the condition. And at the walls of Troy, the god Apollo strikes the armour from his body. A Trojan spear finds him unarmoured, and Hector delivers the killing blow to a man wearing another man's glory as a kind of borrowed skin. When the news reaches Achilles, Homer gives us one of the most physically violent grief scenes in the entire epic. He pours ash over his head, tears at his hair, throws himself in the dust, and the sound of it, Homer says, reaches his mother Thetis from the depths of the sea. It is real grief, but it is also, and this is the part the tragic hero reading needs you not to notice, grief with a body count that traces directly back to a condition Achilles set to protect his own reputation. He knew the war was going badly. He knew his absence was killing his own men. He let Patroclus fight in his place rather than surrender an ounce of the glory he was withholding from everyone as punishment. The narcissistic injury never healed. It just found someone else to spend its cost on. Achilles returns to the war not to save Greece. He returns to punish Hector, and through Hector to punish the wound itself. What follows is not combat, it's an extermination. Achilles cutting through Trojan ranks with a fury Homer repeatedly compares to fire and flood, forces that don't negotiate and don't stop when the threat is neutralized. He finds Hector. He kills him, and then Homer shows us the detail that should end forever any reading of Achilles as a man restoring balance. He pierces the tendons of Hector's dead feet, threads leather straps through them, ties the body to his chariot, and drags it in the dirt in full view of Hector's parents, watching from the walls of Troy. He does this once, then he keeps doing it. For 12 days, Homer tells us, Achilles drags Hector's corpse around the burial mound of Patroclus again and again, and only the direct intervention of the gods, Apollo shielding the body from decay, keeps it from disintegrating under the abuse. Kohut has a specific term for this phase, the part that pure vengeance narratives tend to skip because it doesn't fit the arc of a satisfying revenge story. The insatiability of narcissistic rage. The offender is dead. The debt, by any rational measure, is settled far beyond what justice requires, and the rage doesn't stop because the rage was never actually a transaction with Hector. Hector is dead. What's still alive is the wound. The moment Achilles discovered he was not untouchable, and no quantity of violence against a corpse can retroactively undo a fact that was already true the instant Agamemnon took Briseis in front of the army. This is where the myth becomes something worse than a personal tragedy. It becomes a cultural inheritance. Alexander the Great, 3 centuries before Christ, reportedly slept with an annotated copy of the Iliad under his pillow, a gift from his tutor Aristotle, and when his campaigns brought him to the site of ancient Troy, he stripped naked and ran a ceremonial race around what was believed to be Achilles' tomb, then dedicated his armour at the site. He wasn't drawn to Achilles the man, he was drawn to Achilles the template, the idea that unbearable, ungovernable rage in defence of your own glory is not a disorder to be managed, but the precondition for greatness. That template didn't stay in antiquity, it became the load-bearing myth underneath a specific, durable idea of what a great man is permitted to do to the people around him, as long as the result is impressive enough to call it legend instead of what Kohut would recognise instantly from across a therapy room, an ungrieved wound with an army attached to it. There is exactly one scene in the entire Iliad where Achilles perceives another human being as a person, rather than a mirror, threat, or instrument, and Homer places it as close to the end of the poem as it can go without ending the poem itself. King Priam, Hector's father, an old man with no army and no protection, walks alone into the Greek camp at night, guided by the god Hermes, and enters the tent of the man who killed his son and has spent 12 days defiling the body. He kneels. He takes Achilles' hands, the hands that killed his son, and kisses them. In Butler's translation, Priam tells him he has done something no man before him has ever done. He has put to his lips the hand of the man who killed his children. And then he asks Achilles to think of his own father, Peleus, old and far away, who will also someday want his son's body returned to him for burial. Something in Achilles breaks open that nothing else in the poem has managed to reach. He weeps, not performatively, not for an audience, but for Peleus, for Patroclus, for the totality of what the war has cost, and Priam weeps beside him for Hector, two enemies on the floor of a tent crying for the same thing from opposite sides of it. In Kohutian terms, this is the closest the poem comes to actual repair. A moment where Achilles is finally, briefly mirrored, not as the greatest warrior alive, but simply as someone else's grieving son. And where he extends that same recognition outward instead of demanding it be extended to him. He returns Hector's body, he agrees to an 11-day truce so Troy can hold a funeral, and then the poem ends, not with a battle, not with a triumph, but with the burial of the man Achilles spent weeks desecrating. Homer gives the last word of the entire epic to Hector, the enemy, mourned properly, while Achilles, still alive, still undefeated, still furious somewhere underneath the one night he set it down, gets no ending at all inside the poem's own frame. We know from outside the poem what's coming for him, an arrow to the one unguarded part of his body, the heel his mother forgot to submerge when she tried to make him invulnerable, the single point of exposure on a man who spent the entire epic unable to tolerate exposure of any kind. Here is the part most retellings skip, because it's the part that stops being about Troy and starts being about you. You have had a Briseis moment, not literally, obviously nobody is stripping you of a war prize in front of an assembled army, but you know the shape of it. The meeting where credit for your work went to someone else while the room watched. The group chat where you found out you'd been quietly excluded. The relationship where you were treated as replaceable in front of people whose opinion of you mattered. The comment section where a stranger said the thing that punctured something you didn't know was that thin, and you know because you felt it in your own chest that the reaction those moments produce is rarely proportional. It's not disappointment. It's something closer to the floor dropping out. A flash of rage so total it surprises you, followed by an appetite not for an apology, but for the other person's collapse. You don't want them to understand, you want them to hurt the way you just hurt, publicly, so everyone watching recalibrates. That is narcissistic rage in miniature, running in a nervous system that has nothing to do with Bronze Age battlefields. Kohut's point, and it's the point that makes Achilles frightening rather than merely ancient, is that this isn't a pathology reserved for tyrants and warlords. It's what happens to an ordinary self-structure in anyone when a mirroring wound gets touched. Most people have at least one self-object dependency they've never examined, the job title doing more work than it should for their sense of worth, the relationship they need to be perfect because its imperfection would say something unbearable about them, the public image they've built that cannot survive a single unflattering data point. You are Achilles every time you refuse a reasonable resolution because the resolution doesn't include the other person's humiliation, every time you'd rather burn a friendship to the ground than admit the friend was right about something small, every time you leave a job not because the job is wrong for you, but because someone there saw you fail once and you can't stand being in a room with that memory. Every time you keep the argument alive online long after you've won it, replying to the reply to the reply, because winning doesn't feel like winning until the other person is visibly, permanently smaller than you. Look at what we reward. An entire self-improvement industry teaches people to respond to slights the way Achilles responds to Agamemnon. Cut them off, never let anyone disrespect you, make them regret it, prove them wrong by becoming undeniable. Some of that is healthy boundary setting, wearing a marketing voice. A great deal of it is narcissistic rage with a content strategy, treating ordinary human friction, a disagreement, a missed invitation, a bad review as an assault on the self that only total vindication can answer. We've built an aesthetic around dragging the body. We just don't call it that. We call it main character energy. We call it not settling. We call it winning. The tell is always the same one Homer gives you in Book 9. When someone offers you a reasonable repair, gold, an apology, an honest account of what happened, and it still isn't enough, the injury was never about the thing they took. It's about what the taking proved. And the only cure Homer's own poem can offer, the only scene in 24 books where the rage actually lifts, isn't victory. It's Priam on his knees and Achilles finally letting someone else's grief be as real as his own. Most of us don't get that scene. We don't get the old king walking into our tent at night to hand us the mirror we actually needed instead of the one we'd been demanding. We have to build that moment ourselves, on purpose, every time the floor drops out and the appetite for someone else's collapse shows up disguised as justice. Homer did not write the Iliad to give the world a hero to imitate. He wrote it to show in exacting and merciless detail what an ungoverned self does to everyone standing near it, including, eventually, itself. Achilles is fast. Achilles is unbeatable in single combat. And Achilles is, for all but one night of a very long poem, a man who cannot survive being seen as anything less than magnificent, and who will burn down an army, a friendship, and a corpse's dignity to avoid that sight for one more day. We inherited this story and called it Glory. Alexander ran naked around a tomb for it. Centuries of warrior cultures built their idea of greatness on the exact temperament Homer was diagnosing, not celebrating. And most of us, in far smaller rooms with far lower stakes, still reach for the same script the moment we're humiliated. Withdraw, punish, make them pay. Drag it out past the point where dragging it out serves any purpose except proving to an audience that has usually stopped watching that we were right to be furious. Kohut spent a career trying to explain why some people cannot let an injury simply be an injury. Homer got there first and left the answer in a tent outside Troy, where the only thing that ever actually worked was the one thing Achilles spent 23 books refusing to do. He let someone else's pain be real.